Grand evening, family. Shabbat Shalom. Peace be unto you all that tune in. Welcome back to another Sistah4Sistahs reading session. It's your one and only host, currently but not for long, Sister ChayaFyah. Got some wonderful new sisters that can't wait to come on and have some sister time. With that being said, let's go ahead and talk about the book that we will be reading today. This book is called Matriarchs of the Covenant, written by Adviel ben Levi, brother Zion Lex. And I just like to give a little background on the purpose of the reading of certain books. We as women in the church have been taught a certain way, especially us brown women after slavery and utter land takeover by vampires and just dogs. So we read to learn more about the women who came before us. We take a look at the similarities and the differences and understand how we can do better in certain instances, and in others some things are better just staying the same. So let's get started. The introduction. Understanding the contribution of a matriarch is vital to the growth of a nation. In fact, the word for mother or matriarch in biblical Hebrew is sometimes used interchangeably as designating the nation. Ezekiel 19:2. From the perspective of the Torah, Bible, women are viewed as the builders of the home. Proverbs 14:1. Spiritually speaking, women were not builders in the sense of masonry and carpentry, but in the sense of spiritual and intellectual stimulation and growth. Thus, the book of Proverbs says, "Forsake not the teaching of thy mother." Proverbs 1:8. The biblical matriarchs played an immense role in the spiritual empowerment of the people of the book, Israelites. Thus, it's written, "He who finds a wife finds a good thing." Proverbs 18:22. The centrality of the patriarchs in the Torah underscored the contribution of men throughout the scriptures, yet the contribution of the matriarchs of the covenant is seldomly expounded upon. King Solomon, in his brilliance, synthesized the entire Torah in the book of Proverbs, yet he cleverly culminated the book of Proverbs with the 31st chapter, which speaks about the virtuous woman. In 22 sentences, Proverbs 31:10 through 31, which forms an alphabetic acrostic of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, Solomon describes the true virtue of a woman or matriarch as consisting of qualities, traits, and attributes which facilitates the founding, establishing, and maintenance of the home and those who dwell in it. From the outside in, this may appear to some women as shallow, as it appears to marginalize a woman's role to motherly duties only, neglecting her own pursuits and desires. Yet, if you are reading into the very language of the Torah, the Bible, you'll see that not only is King Solomon right to designate a woman's role as a matriarch, as a chief pursuit for women on a whole, he is also right for the correlating it with the Torah itself. In fact, when the Torah was given, it was the women who were addressed first. As it is written, "Thus shall you say to the house, women of Jacob, and thus shall you tell the sons, men of Israel." Exodus 19:3. In the book of Jeremiah, God tells Jeremiah, "Before you were formed in the womb, I knew you." Jeremiah 1:5. In this analogy, Jeremiah learns that he was ordained a prophet before he was ever born. Yet, we are reminded in this analogy that the development of a child takes place in the womb in a woman. Hence, from a biblical perspective, spiritual nourishment begins with our mothers. Even the birth of our nation is an analogously connected to the Torah, as we were introduced to the Torah immediately following the Exodus from Egypt, Ezekiel 16:4 through 14, where the prophet Ezekiel describes our discovery at birth and subsequent introduction to the Torah. Thus, from the vantage point of the Torah, the womb, the matriarch, has always been a place which has prepared us for greatness. Chapter 1, Eve, the matriarch of all the living. The very first matriarch the Torah speaks of is Eve, whose name in biblical Hebrew means mother of all living, which is Chayafyah. We are taught that Eve's creation was intended to bring man to a state of perfection. For the Torah, Bible says, "It is not good for man to be alone. Therefore, I will make him a helper." In the Torah, man's physical creation precedes that of woman. Genesis 2:7. From man, the Torah teaches us that woman was born. Genesis 2:22. The Torah states that woman's creation was necessary and hence vital for man's attaining good, which entails that woman's creation was intended to bring man to a state of perfection before God. Genesis 2:18. The Torah then goes on to define exactly how woman would bring man to a state of perfection. In Genesis 2:18, we read that woman would essentially perfect the spiritual and physical estate of man by being what the Torah terms an ezer ka-negdo. An ezer is not just a helper, but a deliverer and even a savior. For in 1 Samuel 7:12, after God's help in delivering Israel from the hand of the Philistines, the prophet Samuel erects a stone and calls it Ebenezer, saying, "For the Lord has brought salvation or deliverance to Israel from the Philistines." From this, we learn that the term helper or ezer in Hebrew denotes much more than assistance or mere help. For if God himself is called an ezer and he in no way, shape, or form is inferior, then we know to divest a sense of majesty and spiritual prowess in woman being called an ezer. The second part of woman's gift to man is termed kanegdo. I know I'm probably messing these words up, which comes from the Hebrew words neged as well as hagid. Neged in Hebrew means to oppose or stand in front of. Hagid literally means to tell. The Torah states that Adam named Eve. He named her Chayafyah because she is the mother of all living. Genesis 3:20. What I find most interesting here is that the name Chayafyah or Eve denotes not just life, coming from the verb chaya, but it also denotes speech. For in Psalms 19:3, it states that night unto night declares knowledge. The word used in this passage to denote the act of declaring knowledge through speech is none other than Chayafyah, the very same Hebraic verb base for Eve's name in Hebrew, Chayafyah. What does this mean? This entails that women are considered life giving not just because of their procreative physical nature, but also because of their knowledge declaring spiritual nature, speech. For as King Solomon says in Proverbs 18:21, life and death are in the power of the tongue, speech. So then, contrary to popular opinion, men and women are both builders. For according to the Torah, God built the universe via speech, with the Torah as the blueprint. Man represents wisdom or thought, women represent understanding or speech, which is the articulation or verbalization of thought. These two modes of consciousness are the precursors for everything which was ever created and made or built. Thus, we see that the power of speech is especially strong in women. Even in today's social order, women are viewed as more talkative, more communicative, as well as more articulate about the full spectrum of their thoughts and emotions. The Torah also teaches us that women were created from the rib of man. The ribs serve a twofold purpose in the body. First, the ribs encase and protect the most vital organ in the body, the heart. Secondly, the ribs assist in respiration or breathing. On a spiritual level, the heart and lungs both represent different levels of the spirit. In fact, the sages of Torah teach that the heart and lungs are the seats or resting places of the highest levels of our soul. Thus, the very place from which Eve was created is an indicator of her role as a spiritual protector, just as the ribs protect the heart. It also represents a woman's ability to stimulate spiritual growth, just as the ribs stimulate movement for breathing. Eve was created from man to teach us that we are incomplete until we acknowledge our connectivity to our opposing nature. The wisdom of Adam is revealed in the names he gave every living creature, for he names all of the animal kingdom according to their physical and spiritual essence. Eve's wisdom, however, is revealed in her discourse with the snake in the garden, and from this story, we learned that women have an innate susceptibility to emotions. After Adam is instructed by God not to eat of the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden, he then instructs Eve. In comes the serpent, however, who knows the nature of both species, male and female, and consciously decides to bring his argument to Eve. Question: why didn't the serpent decide to tempt Adam? What was it about Eve that drew the serpent to her as opposed to Adam? The answer to these questions lies in the dialogue between the serpent and Eve. In trying to ascertain the answers to the above questions, the first thing that stood out to me is the fact that throughout the story of the Garden of Eden, the serpent, the woman, and Adam, the Torah only addresses Eve as the woman. And then I immediately realized that Adam did not name Eve until after these events. This perplexed me for a while, yet forced me to meditate on the fact that Eve's name is a direct correlation of what took place in the garden. You see, as noted earlier, Eve's name in Hebrew is Kawa, which means life giving, as well as speech. The very nature of a woman is revealed through speech, as speech is the foundation stone of a woman's character. The snake decided to tempt the woman because he knew even before Adam knew that the nature of a woman is revealed through her speech. The serpent did not seek Eve out because she was the weaker of the two. In fact, he sought her out because her strength through speech was appealing. The serpent knew that he could take woman's greatest strength and use it against her, speech. Eve's wisdom is conveyed in her rebuttals to the serpent. She answers his questions thoroughly and gives additional insight when needed. The woman counter rebuttals the serpent so well that he decides that through her he will seek glory. You see, it is her strength, not her weakness, which appealed most to the snake. The book of Ecclesiastes teaches us that a fool's voice is known through uttering many words. Ecclesiastes 5:2. Hence the saying, speech is silver, but silence is golden. The serpent, in all of his cunning wisdom, knew that all he had to do was keep the woman talking, and surely she'd talk herself into an intellectual corner, giving him the opportunity to strike. The woman's greatest error came by way of allowing an evil force too much attention. By definition, anything or anyone who comes to oppose the will of God is evil. Eve verbally entertained the serpent so long that she made a grave error. She added to the commandments of God when it is explicitly taught that we cannot add or subtract from God's word or law. Deuteronomy 4:2. She tells the serpent that not only did God say, "Don't eat from the fruit of the tree in the midst of the garden," but also not to touch it. Genesis 3:3. When God only commanded that they abstain from eating it. Genesis 2:17. This allowed the snake control over Eve's emotions and intellect, as he succeeded in convincing her that touching the tree doesn't bring death and eating the tree brings much desired wisdom. Thus, through speech, a woman's greatest gift, the serpent was able to beguile her. Our strengths can become our greatest weakness when we don't exercise discretion and obedience to God's word. The story of Eve succumbing to the serpent's deception is not a story about Eve's weakness or the misconstrued weakness of a woman. It is a story about how our greatest strengths can become our weakness when we don't exercise them according to the will of God. Uninformed men misconstrue this story as an indicator of some inherent weakness they believe women have. This couldn't be further removed from the truth. In the opening of this chapter, we saw that woman's very creation was to be an ezer to man, and ezer literally translates not as a helper, but as a deliverer. 1 Samuel 7:12. So surely there is no inherent weakness in woman, for she was created to be man's deliverer. This point is further elucidated and driven home by the fact that King Solomon refers to woman's greatest virtue as Eshet Kail, which literally means in Hebrew the valor or strength of woman, which is usually translated in English as virtuous woman. The word used for virtue or valor in Hebrew is Kail, which literally means to exert strength and is translated in the Torah as army, Exodus 14:4, as soldier, Numbers 31:14, as well as fortress in Psalm 48:14. Earlier, we saw that woman was created to be man's ezer, with ezer denoting deliverer or deliverance. King Solomon then further attests to woman's creative role by calling her Ashet Kail, woman of valor or strength. These attributes, which are inherent in a woman's nature, must change the way many men see women. Women are extremely strong. The Torah is replete with stories that show that where powerful rulers fail in taking a city or some act of military might, women succeed. Men look at women as inferior or weak because flesh and brute strength is the standard by which most men measure might or power. Yet, when the spirit is considered, many will have to revamp their mode of thinking when it comes to measuring the strength of a woman. Women complement man's nature. If man is robust on the outside, woman is robust on the inside or spirit. From the outset, the Torah makes it crystal clear that man and woman were created equal. For according to the Torah, both man and woman comprise the image of God. Genesis 1:27. Man is called Ish, while woman is called Isha. The only difference between these two names is that man or Ish contains a Yod, while woman or Isha contains a Hey. And when these two letters are joined, they spell the divine name Yah, Exodus 15:2, which essentially entails that the very names for man and woman are a testimony of them equally coming together to form and comprise the image of God. These truths are a testimony to the complementary nature of man and woman. So before we as men begin to doubt the strength of a woman, we must seriously consider why God said it is not good that man be alone. Woman, from the perspective of the Torah, the Bible, were created to help bring man to a state of perfection. This is achieved through her divine attributes as a deliverer, a woman of valor or strength, and an oppositional force. The Torah says with regard to woman that she be an ezer kadnego, which translates in Hebrew as a deliverer, ezer, and someone who stands in front of, adjacent to, or opposite negdo. Negdo translates as literally meaning being next to, Genesis 2:18, telling or speaking up to someone, Deuteronomy 17:10, expressing opposite view, Exodus 19:9, and it also denotes a prince who stands before the people, Psalm 76:13. Etymological Dictionary of Biblical Hebrew, page 148. With all of the above attributes in my mind, it would be utterly foolish to see a woman as being anything but God's gift to man. A strong woman who exemplifies herself as being created in the image of God will tell her man or husband things that closest friends won't. A woman of valor will use wisdom to express an opposing view to her husband because of her desire towards his perfection. There is a way to complement one another without contending or competing against one another, and the wisdom of the Torah is instrumental in attaining and reaching that goal. If we are to grow together as one, we must both respect and acknowledge one another's strengths, and woman is far stronger than man gives her credit for. Our spiritual chemistry is so perfectly complementary and divine that we can come together as one and manifest divinity through love of one another and adoration of one another's greatest gifts. Two can only become one when we realize that our greatest strength is manifest in how we see one another in holiness and love. Awesome. Chapter 2, Sarah, a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. The book of Proverbs 12:4 says that a virtuous woman is a crown to her husband. There are many great women throughout the Torah, yet one who stands out the most with the above thought in mind is the matriarch of many nations, Sarah. The very first appellation which the Torah applies to Sarai, whose name was later changed to Sarah, is that she was a very beautiful woman. Genesis 17:11-14. Yet the sages of Torah teach that there is much more depth in describing Sarai's beauty. While the outward appearance may be desirable to the eyes, the spirit of a person is what truly makes them beautiful. Thus, the sages of Torah teach, as the breath or spirit of the blower, so the shape of the vessel, which entails that real beauty is exemplified from the inside out. The spirit, and some people are so beautiful on the inside, their spirit, that it is reflected in the outward appearance as well. Sarai in Hebrew literally means princess. It comes from the Hebraic root sarar, which literally means to rule. Hence, it also denotes royalty. These divine attributes contribute to the majestic nature inherent in Sarai's character. Sarai is a queen, for the Torah says that kings shall come forth from her. Genesis 17:16. It was also in this instance of Sarai's majesty being proclaimed that her name is changed to Sarah, which expands her matriarchal role from one nation to being a matriarch of many nations. Genesis 17:15-16. This spiritual transition from ruling over one to ruling over many is a direct result of the spiritual expansion of her crown. The underlying thought is that when a woman's spirit is pleasing to God, her very nature changes. She no longer can be seen as the same person, as the growth of her spirit must reflect the value of her calling. Thus, her name, which represents her spiritual composition, must be changed, for she has outgrown the vessel she was born in. Abraham, Sarah's husband, was a prophet, Genesis 20:7. This entails that Sarah is a prophetess. We learn that the wife of a prophet is a prophetess from the story Isaiah the prophet. The Torah or the Bible says that Isaiah went into the prophetess or his wife, Isaiah 8:3. From this, we learn that when a man has a genuinely intimate or spiritual connection to prophecy with God, his wife also shares in that connection or that prophecy. The spiritual relationship between husband and wife reaches its full potential when both husband and wife aligns themselves with the will of God or Torah. As both matriarch and prophetess, Sarah's importance and contribution revolutionizes the way most men see women. For a woman is not born to be spiritually complacent. She has vision. She has spiritual aspirations, which, if she pursues with all her might, will transform her very being. A woman of virtue, spiritual valor, envisions a goal and works towards it. While she may be a wife and a mother, she still must pursue a spiritual goal which will transform her life. The relationship between Abraham and Sarah is a relationship which sets the highest standards for husband and wife to attain. Thus it is written, "Look unto Abraham your father and Sarah who gave birth to you." Isaiah 51:2. The relationship that Abraham and Sarah had becomes a template for all spiritual relationships between husband and wife, as exemplifying righteousness. Isaiah 51:1. What made Sarah and Abraham so perfect is that they equally sought after pursuing a greater relationship or connection with God. This then entails that the key to long lasting and meaningful relationships is an equal desire to know or experience God. Sarah was a wise woman with great understanding. We learn this by allegory when Abraham says to Sarah, "Say that you are my sister." Genesis 12:13. Most people have yet to perceive the depth of thought conveyed in those words. Some are even so far removed from understanding the true meaning of this verse that they even question Abraham's faith. By asking why did he need to call Sarah his sister, shouldn't he just have trusted that God would protect him? Most people fail at biblical comprehension simply because they approach these truths with linear lenses. The entire Torah forms the basis of God's will. Therefore, in order to discern the various meanings of biblical passages, one has to view it panoramically. I always say, let Torah teach Torah. Many perplexing passages throughout the Torah become clearer when we include other similar passages in our discernment of its truths. Thus, the book Song of Songs, written by King Solomon, esoterically describes the relationship that God has with the nation of Israel by referring to Israel as his wife. In relating his love for the nation of Israel, he says, "You have ravished my heart, my sister, my wife." Song of Songs 4:9. In Hebrew, the phrase "my sister, my wife" is ekoti kala. Ekoti kala is an enigmatic expression of deep love based on the shared experience of imparting wisdom and understanding. Thus, the book of Proverbs says, "Say unto wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your kinswoman," or relative. Proverbs 7:4. Hence, when Abraham spoke of Sarah as his sister, who was also his wife, he was also relating a spiritual truth, which describes the full depth of his relationship with Sarah, who, although being his wife, was also his spiritual sister. For the depth of love inherent in their relationship was a direct result of their mutual desire for spiritual enlightenment. This then teaches that our greatest relationships are those based in mutual pursuit of enlightenment and spiritual growth. The one who compliments you best is the one who shares your deepest desires. With all of the above in mind, we see now why Sarah played such a pivotal role in the Torah. We are taught in the Torah that man is an authoritative figure in his household, this being a direct result of our first mother Eve, or Kawa in Hebrew, misusing her equality in the Garden of Eden. Thus the Torah says, your desire shall be towards your husband, and he shall rule over you. Genesis 3:16. From this, it can clearly be inferred that women originally was designed to equally rule with man. Yet, as a result of sin, women lost that right. What should also be clear, though, is once sin is removed via a woman who relentlessly pursues righteousness, the stigma is removed and she can, in fact, be considered equal in several respects. I can almost see the expression on the men's faces who are reading this, who may feel as if my opinion is out of bounds. Yet consider this: Sarah was clearly not the average woman. She is the matriarch of nations, and she lived as a prophetess. Her word, therefore, was sufficient for declaring truth, and her husband honoring her thoughts as well. For the Torah says, in all that Sarah says, listen to her voice. Genesis 21:12. This does not mean that men are not an authority in a home. No, not at all. Yet it does clearly say that when a woman is in sync with the will of God, or Torah, her word is just as valuable in a home. Thus, the book of Proverbs says, listen to the instructions of your father, yet forsake not the teachings of thy mother. Proverbs 1:8. This then should cause both men and women to reconsider their value and contribution in a home. From the perspective of the Torah, the Bible, a man has the last word, yet a woman's voice must be heard as well. It's a partnership, not a tyrannical standoff. The legacy which Sarah leaves the world with is the idea that women must go beyond their limitations if they are to ever become transformative. Woman must look deep within to become great, and she must not be discouraged by her position in life, for it is her very nature and purpose to rise above any situation. Chapter 3. The Well of Wisdom and a Virtuous Woman. In the Torah, there were three foundational characters who found their wives near a well. Isaac's wife Rebekah was found near a well. Jacob first sees Rachel near a well. And finally, Moses meets his wife Zipporah near a well. What is the significance of a well? And more importantly, what is the spiritual significance of meeting a woman near a well? Wells have been used in several ancient proverbs to describe wisdom and understanding. For instance, King Solomon says in the book of Proverbs, wisdom, counsel is like a deep well, water in man's heart. Yet a man of understanding will draw it out. Proverbs 20:5, as well as the words wisdom of man's mouth are like a well of deep waters. The source of wisdom is like a flowing stream. Proverbs 18:4. The word for well in Hebrew is beor, which also means to explain or expound. You see, what the Torah is trying to teach us is that the only conclusive truth that we are to base finding an ideal mate on is wisdom. If you are with a man or woman for any reason other than the essence of their beings or wisdom, then all the so-called love you share with that person will eventually fade. For the object of your desire in such a person is based solely upon the time-bound concepts such as beauty and money. However, to he or she who looks beyond the facade of money and beauty and perceives in an individual an immovable force, wisdom, and bases his or her love for that individual solely on the merit of the wisdom that individual poses, then this is a union which God himself comes and blesses. For it is a union deeply rooted in the theme of creation, that two shall join and become one in the light of wisdom and truth. Women in many ways are comparable to water in that they are life-giving, easily transferable, like water, which has no shape of its own, but takes the shape of whichever vessel it fills. Women, too, have the ability to rise to any occasion the spirit or flesh calls for. She can bend or break steel if need be, to separate her children or loved ones from imminent danger. Like water, she is as vital in a home as water is vital to the survival of the body. Her greatest strength is her spirit, as pliable as rubber. Her spirit can form or take shape within any given situation life may call for. Water is her nature and her divine realm. She is the womb of creation, where the life giving waters sustain the emergence of a new soul in the flesh. Her well of insight has great depth, and a man of understanding may be able to draw and drink from the wisdom contained within her soul. In fact, the very word for mother in Hebrew is Ima, which is spelled Aleph and Mem in Hebrew. Aleph in Hebrew literally means to teach. Mem in Hebrew literally means water. Thus, from the perspective of Hebraic thought, a wife or mother has a special affinity to water, which empowers her with a fluid-like character. Women are arguably more emotional than men. Like water, a woman's emotions can become unstable quickly. Yet, just like water, as the storm passes and the water stills, you'll be able to perceive in woman an inner beauty, which is truly a reflection of the beauty of heaven above, just as the oceans of the world receive their blue hue or color from the reflection of the sky above. With the right intentions and the spiritual fortitude to sustain a real woman, a man can catch a glimpse of what it means to be in heaven. For a woman's love is as divine and nurturing as the love the Creator bestows upon all of his creations. Chapter 4, Black Love. Black love begins with our perception of our innate beauty, with our perception of the divine darkness within, from which springs forth light. The Creator himself says that he dwells in thick darkness. 1 Kings 8 and 12, which is a poetic epithet for describing that which is intangible to the mind or imagination, and yet still very perceivable to the spirit. Darkness in Hebrew is the word koshet. It comes from the Hebraic root kashah, which means to be still or silence. It is also related etymologically to the Hebrew word kashash, which literally means to sense. Darkness, hence, is a place where the mind is so still that our spiritual senses are amplified and animated. Black in Hebrew is shakor, which literally means to seek and discern in Hebrew. Psalm 63 and 2. Its usage in the Torah is primarily to represent dawn, the blackest part of the night, from which light emerges. Thus, black from a Hebraic perspective literally means the place from which light emerges, and thus we learn that all seven colors of the rainbow have their origin in black, which is the initial stage of the emergence of light. Genesis 1, 2 through 3. So when we open up that ancient book of King Solomon in Song of Songs 1 and 5, where it says, I am black and deeply desirable, for the word translated as comely or beautiful is the Hebrew word nawa, which comes from the Hebrew root awa, which literally means deep desire, Genesis 3 and 6. We know then that King Solomon is describing the physical and spiritual depth of not just the skin tone, but that inner space from which light emerges. So while we may look at all the colors of man and woman and nature and find beauty in each one, know for surety that you cannot appreciate a thing without appreciating its source. Thus, black, the color from which all colors emerge, is the very essence of light or love. The matriarch of the home is immersed in the deepest and darkest well. From her emerges life giving water. As such, she is also comparable to an ocean, which is too deep to measure, yet vital enough to desire to draw near to. She is the essence of love itself, for the Hebrew word for womb is rekem, and rekem also means love in Hebrew. Thus, the love of a matriarch conveys both the essence of life, the womb, and love. Her love, once awakened, can be an extremely powerful experience. Approach a woman's love with caution, for once a woman loves, you will be surrounded by an emotional canopy, which could either shade and protect or engulf and envelope. Choose wisely. The quintessential meaning of love finds its best expression in the womb of a woman. Thus, when speaking of love, we can't divorce it from its intrinsic feminine nature. For love in Hebrew is the word ahab, which literally means to give in Hebrew. Therefore, the ultimate effect of love is realized and brought to its full potential in the ultimate receiver, woman. For man is a giver, causative by nature, and woman is a receiver, receptive, reactive by nature. And in order for love to be fully manifested, both man and woman should spiritually consider and embrace the inner beauty of one another's nature. Just as it is the nature of darkness to both conceal and reveal light, so it is the nature of love to reveal and conceal who we truly are. Chapter 5, Rebecca. My love is as a lily among thorns. Song of Songs 2 and 2. The story of Rebecca begins as a story about how to quantify or measure the hidden virtue of a woman. Rebecca is introduced in the biblical narrative as the sister of Laban, who later on fathers two daughters, Leah and Rachel. Abraham, the father of all the biblical patriarchs, was getting old and his days were dim, and he desired to see his son Isaac married before he transitioned or died. The son of Abraham, however, couldn't just marry any woman. He could not marry of the daughters of the land of Canaan, for they were known to be immoral, ungodly, and physically and spiritually unchaste. As the son of Abraham, Isaac was to become heir to all of Abraham's possessions. He was also to become heir to Abraham's spiritual legacy as a prophet of God and patriarch of the covenant. Thus, the woman who would be chosen to become the matriarch of the covenant had to possess character traits worthy of such a higher calling. So Abraham instructs the steward or head servant of his house that he should go and find a wife for his son Isaac in Aram Naharaim, Mesopotamia, where Abraham's family dwelt, that his son Isaac may find a wife from common yet noble stock. Eliezer, Abraham's servant, devises a very wise plan in his pursuit for the woman who would become the matriarch of the covenant. He first prays to God and asks that he continue to show kindness to his master Abraham by aiding him in his pursuit of a wife for Isaac. He finds a well of water, Genesis 24 and 13, and asks God for a sign that whomever of all the daughters of the city comes to draw water from this well, and he asks her to draw water that he may drink. And she obliges and even offers drinks to the camels he is with, will be the woman who he will ask to marry Isaac. This sign serves as test of virtue. Eliezer knew that a virtuous woman exemplifies kindness to all. She is inherently motherly in her consideration of the needs of others. Therefore, he sought to test her ability to show love beyond measure. He sought to reveal the virtue concealed in her soul, yet exemplary in her actions. The Torah defines marriage as sacred. As such, the very partners we choose should exude traits which convey righteousness. With reference to marriage, the Torah says, "He who finds a wife finds a good thing and obtains favor from the Lord." Proverbs 18 and 22. Why does the Torah speak of finding a wife? Are women not adjacent to men? Do we really have to go out of our way to physically find women? No. The Torah employs the term find in order to teach us that we are not to choose our mate based on anything physical alone. Instead, we are to find and search out the inner character and hence spirit within an individual. We should not select a wife or a husband for any reason other than spiritual and moral fortitude. For the Torah goes on to say, finding a wife is a good thing, and you obtain favor from the Lord when you find a wife. This is an extremely powerful affirmation of a virtuous woman's value and worth. She comes with good tidings from the Lord. This means that a virtuous woman brings a blessing from God in the home. Ever been to a messy bachelor's or single male home and said to yourself, this place needs a woman's touch? So it is then that a virtuous woman comes with divine favor from heaven above, full of the blessings of God, but you must search for her. Not everyone can fill the shoes of a virtuous woman. Some things in life just cannot be traced. This is the meaning behind Eliezer's prayer to God and test of Rebekah. He wanted to put her in a predicament which would reveal if she was in possession of true virtue, and she passed with flying colors. The very next phase is almost, if not just as, important as assessing a woman's virtue. The very next question which Eliezer asks Rebekah is, whose daughter are you? Genesis 24 and 23. This is an inquiry which is deeply rooted in wisdom. Understanding the root is key to discerning the fruit of the tree. Most people are a reflection of some of their parents' traits, whether good or bad. Very few people can completely divorce themselves from any negative traits their parents displayed. This is why it is equally important to inquire of the character traits of the parents of our loved ones. Yet ultimately, it is the virtue which your mate exemplifies which matters. For it is definitely possible to rise above the negative environments we were raised in. This story reveals so many important elements of how to pursue finding a wife, and if we pay close attention, we can learn exactly what it takes to acquire a virtuous woman who will one day become the matriarch of her family. Choose wisely. So Eliezer, Abraham's servant, gives her the equivalent of a dowry, as he puts a gold ring in her nose, bracelets in her hand, and a multitude of camels bearing a variety of precious goods. In the ancient world, this was the equivalent of saying that she was marrying a man of great substance who would be able to support her fully. The lesson learned here is that a man should not look to impress a woman with what he has before he tests her heart, her mind. For anyone who sees great substance will be tempted to do whatever it takes to be part of that lifestyle, even if it means acting or auditioning for a role which is contrary to your true character and spirit. Thus, notice, it was only after Eleazar tests her that he bestows upon her the equivalent of a queen's ransom. This is a very important truth to grasp in more ways than one. For finding a wife should begin with a man who is already financially stable, who can show that he can provide for his wife and future family. Doing all the above in reverse order is the main reason why most marriages fail. The cart is erroneously put before the horse. A man doesn't have to be a millionaire to gain your attention. That's not wisdom either. But understanding teaches us that in order to maintain and provide for a family, a man must be ambitious and showing signs that he can provide. After Rebekah emphatically articulates her virtue, Eleazar takes her to see Isaac, her future husband, Genesis 24:61. Now Isaac had just lost his mother Sarah, the wife of Abraham, Genesis 23:1-2. The Torah says that as Rebekah journeyed towards Isaac, Isaac was immersed in prayer. The term used in Hebrew to denote the mode of prayer Isaac was immersed in is suach, which entails deep and intense meditation, where one literally pours their soul out in supplication towards God. As it is written, he pours out his prayer, Psalms 102:1. Isaac was grieved deeply over the loss of his mother. As Rebekah approached with a great caravan, Isaac was mourning the loss of his mother through intense meditation and prayer. As he was praying, he lifted up his eyes and saw Rebekah approaching. Upon catching eyes, both Isaac and Rebekah began to draw near in spirit. Rebekah asked Eleazar, "Who is this man who walks in the field towards us?" Genesis 24:65. Eleazar tells her who he is, her future husband, and she immediately covers herself with the veil. This is a testimony to the chastity, modesty of a virtuous woman. She doesn't desire to win hearts with any outward beauty. She desires to conceal her physical beauty in order to first reveal her inner spiritual beauty. Chapter 6, Leah. A bitter tree is a fruitful vine. The story of Leah has rich meaning and deep insight within the biblical narrative. Leah is introduced in the Torah as the older daughter of Laban. Genesis 29:16. Leah's name in Hebrew literally means mature female cow. In the ancient world, cows were a sign of fertility and material substance. In the animal kingdom, cows are extremely fertile. To a cattle herder, cows indicated the potential for great wealth and material blessings. In describing Leah's appearance, the Torah says that she has weak eyes. Genesis 29:17. The sages of the Torah, great biblical commentators, relate that continuous weeping was the cause of Leah's weak eyes, quote unquote. Leah, as mentioned above, was the older of two daughters, Leah and Rachel, Genesis 29:16. Her father, Laban, was the brother of the matriarch Rebekah, Genesis 24:29, who herself had twin sons, Esau and Jacob, Genesis 25, verses 25-26. Seeing that Esau was her uncle's oldest son, she reasoned that she, being the oldest daughter, would have to marry him, while her younger sister Rachel would be marrying the younger brother Jacob. Esau, according to the Torah, was a hunter, a man of war, who he even sought to kill his own brother Jacob, Genesis 27:41. Jacob, on the other hand, who was the younger brother, is described in the Torah as a man with a close relationship with his mother, who is also very tactful and is a scholar dwelling in tents or academies. Genesis 25:27. Leah's heart could not bear the thought of marrying Esau, and she was therefore accustomed to crying whenever she thought about it. Therefore, the Torah describes her as having weak eyes. There is so much to grasp already, reading into the text. Leah must have been a righteous woman if the very idea of marrying a man without morals brought tears to her eyes frequently. As outgoing as Esau was, and as manly as the Torah describes him, what matters most to Leah is the vantage point of his moral compass, whether he was for righteousness or against it. The above introduction is immersed with rich insight and advice. No matter how much money a man may have, no matter how strong and handsome he may be, if his morality is lacking, he will never compliment you. Far too many women today seek relationships with all the wrong men. They walk past all of the right men and run towards the wrong types of men. Material wealth is not a bad thing at all, for the bills most definitely have to get paid. Yet, if your desire for a husband is based solely on his material success, you will surely miss out on a blessing which cannot be compared or measured by material possession. The very best things in life cannot be grasped by the hand. They can only be experienced in the spirit, and they are very palpable to the mind. A man who has a relationship with God first will always give his last to you. A man who knows God and desires to be greater spiritually seeking has more wealth than you can possibly imagine, for his legacy of spirit will outlive him, and his children will be blessed for generations to come because of the righteous template he left behind. Leah desired more from life and wealth for what she thought was her irreversible destiny, marrying Esau. But God hears the prayers of the righteous, Psalms 34:17. And by divine providence, Leah becomes the wife of Jacob. Jacob, however, loved Leah's younger sister Rachel, whom he also married. When God sees that Leah is not loved, he opens her womb and she conceives and has Jacob's very first child. The bitter tree thus becomes a fruitful vine. The love that Leah looked for from her husband became manifest in her children. There are so many relationships today which become greater once children are born. Children are like spices to a relationship. In a healthy environment, they can enhance a relationship, just as spices enhance the flavor of foods we eat. Most men can tell you that when the woman they are with becomes the mother of their child, she is virtually transformed before their eyes. When a wife becomes a mother, she undergoes a spiritual metamorphosis, like the butterfly, which was once a caterpillar. She sheds her former glory in exchange for a much higher garment, which reveals a beauty once concealed deep within her. Children are a blessing. They add spirit and grace to a home, and they ensure the survival of our legacies. Now, Leah's first son was conceived due to God blessing her by opening up her womb, because he saw that she was not loved by Jacob, her husband, like Rachel was. Genesis 29:31. Leah names her son Reuben, saying, God has seen my affliction, therefore my husband will love me. Genesis 29:32. Sounds familiar. How many women do you know who are with someone and feel unloved and believe that children will change their significant other's disposition towards them? The truth of the matter is, this is only true in healthy relationships where the man truly loves a woman. Children bring that love and bond to a higher level in healthy relationships. Most relationships today are the polar opposite. they are unhealthy. So we live in a world full of children born in homes where love does not occupy a space or time. Love can only grow, it doesn't magically appear, and our women need to discern the difference. In a healthy relationship, children cause the love in a home to grow stronger. Conversely, in an unhealthy relationship, having children will not make love magically appear. It is there and enhances, or it's simply not there. Leah gives birth shortly again to a second son and names him Simeon, and says, "For the Lord has heard that I was hated." Genesis 29 and 33. From this verse, we learn that Leah definitely prayed and poured out her heart to God because of the pain she felt from not being loved by her husband. For she exclaimed that the Lord heard that she was hated. This is also another testimony of her righteousness. For the Torah says that God hears the prayers of the righteous, as it is written, "The Lord is far from the wicked, but he hears the prayers of the righteous." Proverbs 15 and 29. This teaches us that righteousness is the gate of holiness. If you allow life's bitter realities to compromise your righteousness, you will stunt the growth of the fruitful vine of holiness. As defeated as life can sometimes make us feel, we still cannot give up by forsaking our sense of morality. In life, there will be several tests, each different from the next. Yet we have the ability to use these tests as a spiritual stepping stone, giving us an audible voice with the Creator and man, where we are heard in heaven above and earth below. A third son is born to Leah. Now she says, "This time my husband will be joined to me, for I have borne him 3 sons." And he, God, named him Levi. Genesis 29 and 34. Something very different happens with the birth of this son. In reference to her 2 prior births, the Torah says that she named him. Genesis 29, 32 through 33. The third son, Levi, however, the Torah says he named him, alluding to the fact that this child was named by God. With the first son, she prayed that her husband would love her. Genesis 29 and 31. After her second son's birth, she simply exclaimed that God heard that she was hated. Genesis 29 and 32. The third birth, however, she does something different. She prays that her husband be joined, attached to her. Genuine love comes from spiritual attachment. Leah's spirit is growing with each child. She is drawing closer to a much higher calling each time. This teaches us that adversity is key to spiritual growth. We cannot become elevated until we experience what it feels like to be humbled. When Leah reached the level of spirituality where she realized that in order to achieve and experience love, spiritual attachment must be sought. It was immediately then that God himself intervenes and names this child Levi, who would go on to be the heir of the priesthood, the highest office in Hebrew culture. Just as Leah reached a great height in understanding that love is a bond which must be forged by spiritual infusion, the Creator elevates her and her child, securing the eternal priesthood to the Levites, sons of Levi. It is very important to note that Leah went through great adversity before reaching this spiritual plateau. She had to overcome one of the greatest trials in marriage, feeling unloved. Leah's story is a testimony of the power of not giving up on love. Love, by definition, is unconditional, giving. It comes from the Hebrew word ahav, which is itself rooted in the Hebraic root hava, which literally means to give in Hebrew. Ahav has an aleph prefix to it, which makes it the first person future in Hebrew, thus transforming haba to give into ahava, which literally means in Hebrew, I will continually give, or unconditional giving. Leah truly exemplifies unconditional giving or love, for she championed her desire to unconditionally give of herself to her husband, thus transforming her spiritually as she became the vessel of the royal priesthood of the Torah. Leah conceives again and has a fourth son, this time saying, now I will praise the Lord. Genesis 29:35. This was the highest revelation she experienced. Leah had finally reached a level where there was simply no higher realization than the fervent desire to praise God. Her first three births represented an inner struggle and desire to be loved by her husband. However, by the fourth pregnancy, she ascends her spiritual ladder and seeks a more personal relationship or love with the Creator. This is essentially one of the most quintessential lessons one can learn from life. Love takes much practice. Love by nature is transformative. Love will not allow you to be the same person you once were. For love inherently is the divine alchemy of the soul. Like alchemy, love brings you from one form or a state to a completely different spiritual composition. We learn to love first by example. What we learn from our parents and how we relate to our family, our loved ones, and friends. Once we perfect our love towards our fellow man, our love for God is brought to a much higher estate. What was once viewed as a bitter vine became an extremely fruitful tree. Leah began her marriage feeling unloved, yet her spiritual composition was so strong that she simply would not give in, thereby becoming self-defeated. Leah would go on to have a total of 6 sons, yet the two which stood out the most are those children who were born during a time when her spirit became more aligned with truth and God's will. Thus, she was rewarded for her spiritual consistency by becoming the matriarch of the priesthood, Levi, and the kingship, Judah. We all desire to be loved, yet the wisdom gained in this story teaches us that in order to be loved, one must first show love. One must give of his or herself to the point of nullification, where our very core essence is embedded in what we give to the world. The desire to show love, however, should not come with expectations. Your love should not be dependent on any temporal phase or emotion. Your love should not come with restrictions or barriers. For by definition, love is unconditional giving. And as soon as you set conditions for love, you are no longer talking about love. The sages of the Torah teach that the world is built on love, as it is written, the world is built on love, Psalms 89:2. Leah is the paradigm for love as defined in the Torah. If you look deep within her story, you will see the very spirit of love. Chapter 7, Rachel, the face of love. The spirit of a woman can sometimes be so beautiful that you can see a reflection of it in her face. For as the breath or the spirit of the blower, so the shape of the vessel. Rachel is very misunderstood in biblical thought. She is lauded as a woman of rich outward beauty, yet she was far from being just a pretty face. Like her sister Leah, Rachel's name in Hebrew refers to livestock. for her name literally translates in Hebrew as a young female sheep. Like every name mentioned in the Torah, the attributes inherent in her name became manifest in her deeds. Rachel was also a shepherdess. Genesis 29 and 9. In fact, the last letter of her name is the Hebrew letter Lamed, which is the pictograph Hebrew was represented as a shepherd's staff. The shepherd's staff was used to guide, direct, and steer the sheep where they needed to go. Hence, the letter Lamed literally means to guide as well as to teach. As a shepherdess, this meant that Rachel was a gifted woman. For before one can lead, they must first follow, and before one can teach, they must first be a good student. Rachel and Leah came from Aramaic stock, Aram Naharim, the land of Abraham's kinsmen. Although the proof this land did not necessarily exemplify piety or righteousness, Abraham was careful to tell his servant that he is to search and find a wife first his son for his son Isaac there, because he knew it was the place of his kinsmen, who, although were not altogether righteous, they still stood out as a lily among thorns among the natives of their land. Genuine love is an amazing force. It captivates the spirit in ways nothing else can. The Torah introduces Rachel as a shepherdess, head of the flock of her father's house. Interestingly enough, such was the description of Jacob. He too was the head of his father's flock, surpassing his older brother Esau in good deeds. Life is such that whatever we are, we attract. In vain do many people search all their life for the one intimate partner. The key to finding the one, however, is first becoming the one. When two stars cross paths, they're usually traveling similar speeds. So it is in terrestrial life, in order to cross paths with someone similar, yet who is distinct enough to complement you, you must be inspired equally with a similar drive. Both Rachel and Jacob were the youngest children of their household, which in ancient times meant that they were by default not a first choice to be heir of their family's household and prosperity, both physically and spiritually. Yet, both of them still stood out, for they were driven by the Spirit, not acceptance or privilege. The Torah tells us that as Rachel drew near to draw water for her flock, Jacob was already there waiting. This teaches us that whatever we desire to become or achieve is awaiting our arrival. Yet in order to grasp it, we must first move and work towards it. As Jacob approached the well, he saw several flocks and shepherds gathered around it, around the mouth of the well, which had a huge stone around it. Genesis 29 and 1 through 8. The stone covering the opening of the well was so big that the shepherds would wait for several fellow shepherds to arrive so they could join hands and remove the huge stone from the opening of the well. Now, as Rachel drew near, it was told to Jacob who she was, and as she got closer, he saw her and her father's flock and single-handedly removed the huge stone from the mouth of the well. Genesis 29 and 10. If the desire to love someone doesn't inspire you to transcend your nature, you are not truly inspired to love that person. Love is transformative, and it is also not bound by time. Contrary to popular opinion, love at first sight is absolutely possible, especially when wisdom is the base of one's vision. Jacob was moved with immense inner strength when he moved the stone from that well. He was motivated by two things that he saw, which were the very sight of Rachel and the sight of her tending the flock as a shepherdess. The Torah doesn't tell us about Rachel's beauty until 7 verses after Jacob already meets her, Genesis 29 and 17. This means that when the Torah says that Jacob saw Rachel, the term saw denotes looking even beyond her outward beauty. When wisdom is at the base of one's vision, you can look at a person and see their heart or their mind. By this time, Jacob had already communicated with God several times. He was a prophet as well. Thus, when he looked at her, he saw much purity in her spirit. The Torah also relates that he saw her flock, which entails that he took notice that she was a shepherdess, which automatically comes with definitive spiritual properties. Wisdom increases our vision. It enables us to look beyond the facade of materialism and see deep within the character or spirit of that which we are focusing on. When Jacob looked at Rachel, he saw a matriarch, and when he looked at her flock, he saw that just as a virtuous woman can manage her household, so was Rachel ready to be heir of his. The narrative within the biblical text gives us so much insight on how to become and achieve greater things in life. The ability to see and discern what is good and right for you comes from experience with wisdom and understanding. This is why education is key to transitioning higher levels in life. You cannot ascend the corporate ladder without the proper education, and similarly, you cannot ascend the spiritual ladder without the proper edification. The stories of our earliest matriarchs prepare our women with a template of what it is to be virtuous and spiritually elegant. Just as there is an etiquette of the body and how we physically carry ourselves, so is there an etiquette of the spirit and how we spiritually carry ourselves. We live in an era where women have surpassed men in lewd behavior. What was once an expression of man's unchaste thoughts has now become the theme song of many women. There is a forgotten legacy that we must all rediscover and come back to. Our women must return to their former glory. Your outward beauty can no longer be sufficient to introduce and describe who you are. In the world of commercial sales, there is such a thing as direct advertisement and indirect advertisement. Direct advertisement is a commercial strategy geared at targeting an audience with a low attention span or intellect. Indirect advertisement is geared towards targeting an audience which grasps things easily. What's the difference, you may ask? The attention you don't solicit or advertise is the attention with a greater capacity to appreciate you. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are known as the founding fathers of our heritage, yet they did not work alone. We had matriarchs as well, who also played a foundational role in the establishment of the nation of the biblical chosen people. If we carefully study and analyze the individual stories of the early matriarchs, we will see a rich legacy of women who equally played an integral role in the formation of the elect of God, or the children of Israel. This enhances the view that you cannot have a nation with no women contributing to the cultural, spiritual, and intellectual legacy. The early matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel, were the spiritual backbone of the nation. If the future of a child is nurtured in the womb, then the future of a nation is nurtured by the contribution of women as well. We can only respect our diverse roles and views when we learn to appreciate our distinct contributions. Therefore, in order for women to be motivated to reach higher, our brothers are going to have to start painting a more Torah-based picture of a woman's contribution and value to the nation, which is spiritually immense to see and behold. Chapter 8. Miriam, I sent Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. While there are many women with great contributions in the Torah. Miriam stands out among a few others who were directly called by God to service his will. From the outset, Miriam is first mentioned by name in the Torah, Exodus 15:20, adjacent to the divine appellation prophetess. This is extremely telling, for although Miriam is mentioned in the Torah, prior to this, she is not mentioned by name. Yet the first time she is mentioned by name, she is also called a prophetess. This conveys that the calling of Miriam's name is synonymous with her being proclaimed a prophetess. What is also interesting is that she is also referred to as the sister of Aaron alone here, with no mention of Moses. This entails that Miriam's prophecy preceded that of Moses' prophecy, for she prophesied before Moses was even born. Miriam is the eldest of 3 children, with Aaron being the second born and Moses being the baby, the last child born to Jochebed and Amram. Miriam's name in Hebrew comes from the Hebrew verbs which signify bitterness and rebellion. Miriam was born into a very harsh and bitter environment, plagued by the spiritual bitterness of Egyptian slavery. Miriam, however, was unlike most slaves. She, like her mother, was a rebel. The Torah first introduces Miriam not by her name, but by her deeds or title. The Torah says that Pharaoh addressed the Hebrew midwives and commanded them that when they are helping a laboring mother bring forth child, if they see a male child, they shall kill him. But if they see a female child, she shall live. Exodus 1 and 15 through 16, however, the Torah also says the Hebrew midwives feared God and therefore did not follow the commands of Pharaoh, but instead they saved the male children as well. Exodus 1 and 17. Okay. This was an act of spiritual rebellion in that the Hebrew midwives did not follow the commands of Pharaoh. Furthermore, we are told the names or titles of the Hebrew midwives. One Hebrew midwife was called Shiphrah. This was Jochebed, the mother of Miriam, Aaron, and Moses. She was called Shiphrah because she beautified the newborn infants, meaning she cleaned them off and cleansed them. The other Hebrew midwife was called Puah because she soothed the crying infants with her voice. Interestingly enough, there is an ancient scroll or papyrus from Egypt in the Brooklyn Museum known as the Brooklyn Papyrus. The papyrus contains the names of various slaves in Egypt. 2 names which immediately stand out most in this ancient document are none other than Shiphrah and Puah, who, according to Hebrew tradition, as evidenced above, are the mother, Shiphrah, Jochebed, and sister, Puah, Miriam of Moses. Since its discovery, this papyrus has been at the center of several debates, as the biblical narrative of Moses and the children of Israel's slavery in Egypt now has one more historically identifiable marker to attest to the authenticity of the biblical narratives. This evidence adds to the notoriety of Miriam, for in order for this document to have been preserved for so long, someone entrusted with it must have saw great importance to the preservation of her story, which impacts us today who are at least 3,500 years removed from her era. I had the opportunity to visit the Brooklyn Museum and assess the papyrus myself, and it was quite an awe-inspiring experience. just to be adjacent to and arm's length away from a piece of history which connects us to our ancient ancestors. If you are ever in the NYC area, I definitely recommend that you visit the Brooklyn Museum and witness a piece of our history, which tangibly connects us to the intangible spirits of our ancestors. Miriam's story is pervaded with several inspirational events. From since she was a young girl, she exuded great strength and fearless character traits. When Moses was born, his mother hid him for 3 months. When she was no longer able to hide him, she placed him in an ark and sealed it shut and set it afloat on the Nile River, placing the infant Moses in God's hand, as it were, leaving his fate to be determined by the mercy of heaven. As the ark carrying Moses floated along the Nile River, his sister Miriam followed it to see what would become of him. And the daughter of Pharaoh was bathing in the Nile River at the time, and she noticed the ark, opened it up, and saw baby Moses. She called for Moses' sister, who apparently was also one of her maids, and Miriam suggested to Pharaoh's daughter that a Hebrew woman be sought out to nurse the baby, which Pharaoh's daughter agreed to, and Miriam cunningly summoned for her mother, Jochebed, the mother of Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Exodus 2 and 1 through 10. This was clearly a part of the divine providence of God. These events took shape in a way which attests to God's divine hand intervening in these matters. The qualities which Miriam possessed rightfully made her an heir to the covenant. She was fearless, steadfast, and fervently loyal towards the will of God. The leadership qualities inherent in her story are a direct testimony of the potential of virtuous women of valor or strength. It was in Miriam's merit that the well accompanied the Israelites throughout their journeys, so that the people always had water to drink. In Numbers chapter 20, right after the Torah describes the death of Miriam, it immediately says that the people had no water to drink. The sages teach that this juxtaposition entails that it was in Miriam's merit that the people always had water to drink, as she saw to it that baby Moses was protected as he drifted along the waters of the Nile. The leadership qualities that define Miriam are further attested to when God said, I brought you out of the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. And I sent before you Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Micah 6 and 4. The sages teach that Moses was sent to teach the law. Aaron was sent to atone for the people, and Miriam was sent to instruct the women. Thus, we see that from the perspective of the Torah, women can play just as integral a role in Scripture as the men do. Whatever Miriam set her heart to accomplish, she did, and God was with her because she feared God and put him first above all things. This was the key to Miriam's greatness as a leader and even her prophetic calling, which will be discussed in more details in the latter chapters. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, Proverbs 9 and 10. Fear is the first gate of wisdom. If you desire to know wisdom, you must exemplify fear of God. The Torah says that Miriam was God-fearing, Exodus 1 and 17, and implicit in that statement is her intimacy with wisdom. The Hebrew word for fear is yirah. It's related to the Hebrew word ra'ah, which means to see. Fear increases our spiritual vision. It gives us clarity about the boundaries of morality and enables us to see through the heart of one's action and be able to discern motive and intent. The God-fearing attribute ascribed to Miriam was the hallmark of her prophetic vision. We learn from Miriam's story then that we can transcend any adverse environment with the fear of God, as it increases our vision and grants us spiritual clarity. We also learn that there is no situation so ethically challenging that we must give in and bow our knees to it. On the contrary, any system which defies your morality and challenges your fear of God, you are commanded to rebel against that system by any means necessary. Miriam risked her life to save the male children among the Hebrews because her fear of God was greater than her fear of death. Whenever the fear of God within you is trumped by an external force, you are dead already, spiritually speaking. Better it is to serve God with fear than to serve man in fear. For when confronted by life's challenges, there is only one thing which will assure your success, and that is the fear of God. Miriam was greatly respected by the people, and she was called by God. Thus is the portion of those who fear God. It will be well with them among men, and they'll be acknowledged by God. For morality is defined by your fear of God, and you will be measured and proved through it. Chapter 9, Deborah, the palm tree of Deborah. Immediately following the era of Moses and Joshua, the children of Israel fell into sin once more. Whenever the people sinned, God would cause a nation to rise up against the people as chastisement for their sins against him. And when the people repented, he would raise judges up, and the judge would save them from the hands of their enemies. Judges 2:1-18. There was one judge which stood out most among the earlier judges of Israel, and she delivered the nation from their enemies, and every man, woman, and child would come to her for judgment. Judges 4:5. This judge was Deborah, or Deborah, whose name in Hebrew comes from the word for speech, which is daber, and this Deborah's greatest attribute came by way of her ability to orate, lead, and judge the people. What is very pertinent to note is that Phinehas ben Eleazar was a contemporary of Deborah. Phinehas was the grandson of Aaron, the brother of Moses, Exodus 6:25. Phinehas is distinguished in the Torah for his zeal for God's glory, Numbers 25:10-12. Yet, as great as he was, God looked past him and chose Deborah as the judge of Israel in those days. This speaks not to the weakness of Phinehas, but to the excellence of Deborah. The Torah introduces Deborah immediately as a prophetess. This is a great indicator of the level of Deborah's prophecy. She was no ordinary prophet. There were thousands of prophets which prophesied to Israel, yet the Torah only mentions 48, not counting the 7 prophetesses, who I will discuss in more detail in the following chapters. Therefore, if there were thousands of prophets sent to Israel, yet we only know of at least 48 by name, this means that those who made the book and were called by name were certainly not your average prophets. They were among the prophetic elites. Deborah is immediately introduced in scripture as a prophetess, Judges 4:5, which for a woman was quite an accomplishment in a clearly male-dominated field. This means Deborah was par excellence, spiritually speaking. To be called to office and chosen to judge above men of notable character and spirit speaks volumes to her spirit and the essential truths which define her. The narrative of Deborah opens up acknowledging her as a judge in Israel, whom all the people came to for judgment. The criteria for becoming a judge is spelled out in the Torah in various places. In Exodus 18:21 says that a judge must be able-bodied or can defend themselves, and they must also be God-fearing. This means that aside from Deborah being God-fearing, in order for her to be a judge in Israel, she would also have to be trained to defend herself. As we see later on in her career as a judge, she even led the nation in war. Judges 4, and 6 through 9. The other criteria for being a judge in Israel is being wise, understanding, and perceived as a head of a tribe. Deborah, whose name in Hebrew literally means to speak or orate, was exceedingly wise and filled with the spirit of understanding. She also was a matriarch, a leading figure among women. These are the criteria which established Deborah as the elect of God, called forth to judge his people Israel. In order to judge, one must be thorough in the laws of God. Thus, even as a woman, Deborah excelled where mostly men are called. This means then that women are to be learned in Torah as well. Women are teachers of the home. Thus, a woman without knowledge of God's law is deficient in her ability to teach her children. We must begin to remind our sisters of the integral role they play in the building of this nation. Deborah was a judge, a leader among women, a matriarch, and a prophetess. This leaves no room for any woman today to relegate the duty of being proficient in Torah learning to a man alone. On the contrary, women are supposed to study and show themselves approved as well, for they are the gatekeepers of the children's education and upbringing. As great as Deborah was as a prophetess, judge, and deliverer of Israel, she is self-described as a matriarch, Judges 5 and 7. Even as a prophetess and a lawgiver or a judge, she saw herself ultimately as a matriarch. This is the rod which measured her most, which fueled and gave her drive as a prophetess and lawgiver or a judge. Deborah was a matriarch. This defies the notion that any woman may hold, which says that in the 21st century and beyond, a woman cannot be marginalized as a matriarch, that a woman's legacy is much greater than raising children and nourishing souls. The story of Deborah is here to remind us that the chief cornerstone of a woman's legacy is in her ability to exemplify her matriarchal attributes. Our legacy is inherent in our design. There is no greater vision of a higher you outside of the paradigm of perfection we were created under. Deborah was a matriarch first. This gave her the ability to transcend gender limitations and become a judge and prophetess in Israel, two offices usually held by men of excellence. We are told that Miriam sat under a palm tree to judge the people. Judges 4 and 5. The palm tree symbolizes a position of righteousness. Thus, the spiritual composition of the righteous is compared to a palm tree. Psalms 92 and 13. For as the palm tree is tall and flourishing, so is the spiritual ascent of the righteous, broad and fruitful. Likewise, the temple walls of the Jerusalem temple, built by King Solomon, had cherubim, an angelic class of heavenly ministers, and palm trees carved all around it. 1 Kings 6 and 29 and Ezekiel 41 and 28. Cherubim are guardians of the tree of life. Genesis 3 and 24. The tree of life is the Torah itself. As it is written, it, or Torah, is a tree of life to those who grasp it. Proverbs 3 and 18. The palm tree symbolizes the righteous who are custodians over Torah interpretation. Thus, right after the incident at the waters of strife, Exodus 15 and 22 through 27, where Israel tested God and was punished with the absence of drinking water, the people came to a bitter body of water, and God instructed Moses to take a tree and place it in the waters, that the waters may be made sweet and drinkable. He then tells Moses that if the children of Israel hearken unto his commandments, that all of the diseases of Egypt will not come upon them. For I am the Lord who heals you. Exodus 15 and 26. The next verse states that as the children of Israel journeyed, they arrived at Elam, where there were 12 springs of water, symbolizing the 12 tribes of Israel, and there were also 70 palm trees, which symbolized the 70 righteous elders elected by Moses in Exodus 24 as custodians over the interpretation of the Torah. The story of Deborah is a transformative story for women. It impresses upon women the idea that the key to the greatness of a woman is in the legacy inherent in her spiritual composition as a matriarch. A God-fearing woman has the ability to transcend her nature and become greater than she could ever imagine herself achieving. A matriarch is a woman led by the fear of God. Her calling as a matriarch is her platform of greatness. What a woman can do who is motivated by the fear of God transcends any foreseeable future for her. She lives a life of transformation, just as Deborah, the matriarch, became a prophetess and a judge, just as the light of the sun hits the body and transforms itself into vital nutrients. So it is that if we allow the light of Torah to enter in unto us, we can and will be spiritually transformed as well. Chapter 10. Esther, the righteous myrtle tree. The story of Esther is a very unique story of spiritual heroism within the Torah. Esther lived during the time of the Medes and Persians' captivity of the nation of Israel. The Persian king Ahasuerus, who some identify as Xerxes, was a very rich and powerful king who became an emperor in his own right. He ruled over one of the largest empires the world has ever seen, with over 120 provinces from India to Ethiopia directly under his rule. Esther 1:1. Yet the strength of his kingship can sometimes leave kings power drunk, thereby rendering their decision making no different than the intoxicated. He was known to be a vain king who enjoyed going out of his way to impress others with his material wealth. One day he ordered his queen Vashti to appear before him as he wanted to show her off to his guests, and she declined. Esther 1:10-12. This led his court advisors to remind him of the severity of such a matter, that if the queen refuses to follow the command of her husband, the king, then just imagine what will happen in every home across the world when women become inspired by this and rebel from their husbands as well. So the king followed the counsel of his court magistrates and wise men and made an example out of Vashti and summoned her to death. Esther 1:13-22. Immediately following this, King Ahasuerus issued a command for young virgins to be sought, from among whom he would choose his new queen. These events were God-inspiring, for the former queen, Vashti, who was put to death, was not altogether innocent. Our sages of Torah teach that Vashti was the granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and daughter of Belshazzar. The sages teach that she alone survived the ordeal of infamous handwriting on the wall on the night of her father's feast, where he was killed by the invading Persians led by Cyrus the Great in Daniel chapter 5. Vashti, therefore, as a former princess of Babylon, had a vendetta against the children of Israel, in particularly the women whom she had charge over. The sages record that Vashti would summon Israelite women to her court, force them to undress, and serve her naked on the Sabbath, thereby causing the Israelite women to violate the Sabbath day. Thus, measure for measure, she was executed. These events led to the appointment of an extremely beautiful Israelite queen, known throughout Persia as Esther, but in Israelite circles as Hadassah. The name Esther is believed to have been given to her as a royal title, being related to the Babylonian and Persian deity Ishtar, the chief female goddess, as the beauty of Esther was said by the Persians to surpass all women and equal only to the great goddess of heaven Ishtar, whom they served. Yet, from the perspective of Hebrew, Esther literally means to conceal, hide, or disguise. This meaning especially becomes significant when Esther conceals her lineage and ancestry from her husband, the king Ahasuerus, by order of her uncle Mordecai. Esther 2:20. The name Esther is known among her people as Hadassah, which literally means a myrtle tree. Yet again, from the perspective of the Torah, a myrtle tree is a symbol of righteousness, as the myrtle tree is known for its beauty and rich growth, and the deeds of the righteous are beautiful before God and man, and the growth of the righteous is compared to the rich flourishing of a palm tree. Psalms 92:12. The prophet Isaiah compares the sprouting up of the righteous to the sprouting up of a myrtle tree, Isaiah 55:13, and Zechariah the prophet describes the righteous remnant of Babylon as myrtle trees, Zechariah 1:8-11. Thus, Esther's real name, Hadassah, exemplifies her greatest attribute, which is not her beauty, but her righteousness. What is extremely significant to note is that although Esther's beauty is highlighted in the Torah, her righteousness is what she is defined from. This conveys to our women that it doesn't matter how beautiful you are, or even Queen Vashti was world renowned for her beauty. What matters most is whether or not you exemplify Torah in your character and speech. The most elegant element in a woman is not her beauty, it's her spirit. For the true value of a vessel is not in its outer appearance, it's in its inner contents. For open a beautiful container of sewage water and its vomiting wait and its beautiful outward appearance will not prevent you from vomiting and rejecting it. Such is the nature of a woman who is only beautiful on the outside. You may initially be drawn in by her beauty and looks, but nothing will prevent you from being sick to your stomach once she reveals her inner contents, which are as toxic as sewage water. Queen Esther is very aware of her power and her potential to bring favor upon an unfavorable people. Her people, the children of Israel, as a result, her uncle Mordecai charges her to conceal her identity as a safeguard for any future attack on the children of Israel. At this very time arose a wicked ruler, newly promoted in the king's palace, who greatly hated the children of Israel, as he was a descendant of the biblical Amalekites, a people self-described as being the sworn enemies of God and Israel. Exodus 17:16. Direct descendants of the wicked Esau. His name was Haman, and he sought to destroy the children of Israel once and for all. And it was in his emergence and his wicked imaginations that Esther finally came to understand her importance and why she was chosen as queen to a heathen emperor. This conveys to our women that no matter how low they may see themselves in life, know for a surety that your poverty or pain is not by design, but the growth of character earned in an environment conducive to pain and struggle prepares you for a much greater calling, where you may directly or indirectly play a major role in someone's life, thereby transforming your pain into strength and your fears into courage. Stand fast and work towards the salvation of the Lord. Esther's calling was not happenstance, it was by design or heaven. She arose to royalty at the very same time that a wicked ruler, Haman, who unrelentingly sought the extermination of the entire nation of Israel, Esther 3 and 1 through 7. In fact, Haman's name in Hebrew literally means to enrage, or in Haman's case, to be filled with rage. The rage and hate of Haman surpassed the evil of most men, was equivalent to the snake in the Garden of Eden, who was filled with the hate and envy. Thus, from Genesis 1 and 1 to 3 and 14, there are 70 verses in the Hebrew text. What is significant about this is that 70 is known throughout the Torah as a number of judgment. And in Genesis 3 and 14, God metes out punishment to the snake, whose evil intent to destroy that which is good is synonymous with the evil intent of the wicked Haman, Esther 3 and 1, to destroy that which is good, Israel. Thus, from the introduction of Haman, Esther 3 and 1, into scripture and his exit, which culminates with his death, Esther 7 and 10, there are also 70 verses, further exemplifying the depth of Haman's wickedness and evil intent as being synonymous with the snake in the Garden of Eden. As a matter of fact, when God interrogated Adam and Eve regarding the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, the word used to interrogate them in Hebrew is hamin, which is identical in Hebrew to Haman, which entails that as God interrogated them, he was enraged with the snake as well as Haman, who would later rise to interrogate Esther and Mordecai, Esther chapter 3. It was at this opportune time that Esther revealed her ancestry to her husband, King Ahasuerus, in order to gain favor for her people that the evil decree of Haman to exterminate the children of Israel be annulled. Thus, it was her unrelenting spirit of righteousness which allowed her to conceal her beauty and her ancestry. For when Ahasuerus sought Esther initially, she hid, as it were, her beauty, going through great lengths to conceal it from the king. Esther was raised in a home where Torah was the spiritual and intellectual foundation. Thus, she fully understood that what made her most beautiful wasn't her outer shell, but her inner core. For she who seeks to impress the world from the outside in will be in the end empty and void from the inside out. The quintessential lesson learned from Esther's story is that it's possible to be loved for one's inner beauty just as much as one's outer beauty. Modesty begins with concealing those aspects of womanhood that are sacred and divine in their own right. As a partner in life giving, a woman's body becomes a vessel of divine revelation every time she gives birth. And just as the divinity of God is concealed in the heavens, so should a woman respect the sanctity of her body as a divine vessel of revelation and therefore go through great lengths to conceal it. Modesty today is believed to render women to be social misfits. This is true, yet consider this. In a society where wrong is right and right is wrong, every act of righteousness is an act of social misfitism. If you feel left out in a world of wickedness, perhaps your thought don't include righteousness and you have left out holiness, which is the pursuit of a relationship with God. Lastly, the righteous are compared to trees of fruitful vines throughout the Torah, and among them the myrtle tree stands out most. This is Esther, also known as Hadassah. It was not her beauty which saved her people, but her righteousness, which was her desire to be morally correct before God. Just as the myrtle tree has a sweet smell, but a bitter taste, so was Hadassah's righteousness comely to her people and bitter to the wicked Haman, who single-handedly sought the extermination of every single Israelite in the world. Hadassah in her righteousness saved an entire nation from extermination. Righteousness is a defense from death, as it is written, righteousness saves from death. Proverbs 11:4. Esther will be remembered as a matriarch who led the nation in righteousness and delivered them from death. What a template and a design to be patterned after. A matriarch is a woman who is led at heart by righteousness, which is an earnest desire to seek a relationship with God first. Chapter 11, the Torah, Hebrew Scriptures of the Old Testament, encompasses 48 prophets and 7 female prophetesses. The 7 female prophetesses are Sarah, Miriam, Deborah, Hannah, Abigail, Huldah, and Esther. Divine inspiration didn't just rest on men, as the Torah records. It rested in women as well. The Hebrew word for prophet is nabi, which comes from the Hebrew word nabuv, which literally means a channel. Thus, from the perspective of the Hebrew language, a prophet is a channel of the divine will of God, which prepares a prophet for divine revelation, is spiritual edification. You see, the prophetic experience wasn't happenstance, it was by design and method. God did not mystically appear to the prophets. The prophetic experience was a direct result of spiritual edification, deep contemplation and meditation, internal and external isolation, as well as great study. Prophets were the spiritual elites of their day, a prerequisite for what is termed Hebraically as Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, resting upon an individual was intense devotion to the service of God in every way possible. Thus, if one was a prophet, it was already assumed that they were astute in Torah learning. In fact, the sages teach that the prophetic methodology is concealed within the language of the Torah's 613 commandments. Sarah, although the prophetic spirit usually rested upon men, there were still quite a few women who reached this great spiritual office. In fact, there were prophetic academies throughout the land of Israel. One of them in Jerusalem was led apparently by Huldah the prophetess in 2 Kings 22:14. Thus, the spirit of prophecy was born out of immense and intense Torah study as well as spiritual edification. The Torah mentions Sarah initially by 2 names. Sarah is identified as Iscah, the daughter of Haran, in Genesis 11:29. Sarah is here called Iscah because she saw through divine inspiration or prophetically. In fact, it was even suggested that Abraham's prophecy level was inferior to Sarah, as the Torah records that God commanded Abraham to hearken to her voice regarding the matter of Ishmael and Isaac, which Sarah prophetically saw that God's favor and spirit would rest on Isaac and not Ishmael. Miriam, the older sister of both Moses and Aaron, emerges in the biblical text as a leader among women and men. The Torah records that Miriam led the women in song and dance at the sea, Exodus 15. And the prophet Micah records that God sent Aaron, Moses, and Miriam to lead the people out of Egypt, Micah 6:4. From her youth, Miriam was blessed with prophecy. In the book of Exodus 15:20, Miriam is described as a prophetess and she is called the sister of Aaron, without also calling her the sister of Moses. The Torah sages explain this to mean that Miriam was prophesying before Moses was born. In fact, she prophesied his birth and future redemption of his people Israel. Miriam's prophetic level was so high and intense that at one point she even challenges Moses in his prophetic level versus hers. Deborah was a prophetess and a judge in Israel. So intense was the leadership and prophetic ability of Deborah that she outrivaled Phinehas ben Eleazar, who was her contemporary, as judge over all the tribes of Israel, an office which called for great Torah discernment and practice. Deborah sat under a palm tree, which was a symbol of her ability to expound upon Torah and teach the people. as we explored in the chapter dealing with Deborah. Hannah was the mother of the prophet Samuel. She is regarded as a prophetess because when Samuel was born, she predicted that throughout his entire life, he would be lent to the service of God. 1 Samuel 1 and 27 through 28, which came to pass. As Samuel grew to become an anointed prophet of God who would anoint Israel's first two kings, King Saul and King David. Hannah was initially barren, yet she earnestly prayed to God to bless the fruit of her womb that she may bear children. Her prayer therefore became a pillar of light which would illuminate her path to redemption, as well as Samuel, her son, who as a prophet would seek the God of Israel through intense meditation and prayer. Abigail is introduced in scripture as a woman of beauty and discernment. 1 Samuel chapter 25. She is the wife of King David, and she prophesied his emergence as to the throne as the future king of Israel. 1 Samuel 25:28. The anointing of David by Samuel the prophet was a secluded event, yet when Abigail spoke her prophecy of David's future kingship, it was in the ears and eyes of several witnesses. Huldah, as mentioned above, the prophetess, was the head of a prophetic academy in Jerusalem, 2 Kings 22 and 14. Huldah's prophetic level was so great that anointed kings and priests sought the word of God directly from her mouth. Her prophecy came with much authority and power, for she prophesied of the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jerusalem temple. 2 Kings 22:16 through 17. Esther, the sages of the Torah teach that Esther was led by the divine Holy Spirit to lead and deliver her people from potential extermination. Esther is considered a prophetess because she foresaw the threat of her people's extermination by the wicked Haman and did what was necessary to prevent it and was successful in so doing. Esther became the queen matriarch of the nations in her era, and her actions inspired women in several kingdoms throughout the world. The spirit of prophecy may be synonymous with men in the scriptures, yet clearly there were several women who were equally filled with this divine revelation, and some who were even greater than their male counterparts. Chapter 12. Harriet Tubman, or Grandma Moses. Harriet Tubman's story is extremely unique in light of the biblical matriarchs. Harriet Tubman led her people out of slavery through an underground channel known as the Underground Railroad. Due to all of the similarities between the slavery system of America and ancient Egypt, as well as Harriet's unrelenting desire and effort to see her people free, she is also known in historical academies as Grandma Moses, who, like Moses, had a message for Pharaoh: let my people go. My expertise in Torah learning and discernment is in the Hebrew language, especially in the unique, dynamic way that numbers interface with Hebrew consonants or letters. As I was penning this book, I desired to close this book with a special focus on a matriarch of biblical ancestry, yet who is much closer to our era. In exploring this thought, I came across Grandma Moses, Harriet Tubman, who ironically had a lot more in common with Moses than has ever been revealed before. Harriet Tubman lived during the era of Abraham Lincoln, just prior to his appointment as president of the United States. Harriet Tubman was already leading a fight for the free world, the freedom of her people who had long been held captive in a strange foreign land, like the biblical children of Israel, Genesis 15 and 13. Throughout Harriet Tubman's life, the pursuit of freedom for herself and her people became a hallmark of her essential character. As a child, Harriet was never taught to read, yet she had memorized several chapters from the book of Psalms by heart. As Harriet became more immersed in her pursuit of freedom, one of the ways she devised freedom was to lead her people through uncharted underground tunnels and, if necessary, have them recite secret songs that would alert the slaves of any imminent danger or what to do if danger was near. The problem Harriet Tubman faced is that the only songs she knew came from the book of Psalms, which her slave masters were familiar with as well. This led to Harriet creating her own songs based on the Psalms of David, which cried out for freedom and justice. Ironically, Mizmor el Dawid, which literally translates as Psalms of David, is numerically equivalent to 337, which is the numerical equivalence of Harriet Tubman in Hebrew, and she was known for chanting psalms, which signaled her coming or arrival to free the slaves. One such song was Wade in the Water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. Who are those children all dressed in red? God's gonna trouble the water. Must be the ones that Moses led. God's gonna trouble the water. Who are those children all dressed in white? God's gonna trouble the water. Must be one of those Israelites. God's gonna trouble the water. Who are those children all dressed in blue? God's gonna trouble the water. Must be the ones that made it through. God's gonna trouble the water. It gets deeper. The Torah relates that when Moses grew up, meaning when he reached maturity, that he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and he immediately acted in defense of the slave. Exodus 2 and 11. The phrase in Hebrew, when Moses was grown, he went out and saw his brother under his burden or getting beat, is numerically equivalent in Hebrew to 1840, the same as the term Underground Railroad in Hebrew. Interestingly enough, Harriet Tubman, when she was 12 years old, age of young adulthood for women, and working out in the field, she saw another slave being punished. Harriet stood up to help the slave who was in trouble. The overseer threw a rock at Harriet's head, causing her to suffer seizures the rest of her life. Harriet Tubman was truly a modern day Moses, especially from the perspective of Torah deduction and inference. What Harriet Tubman accomplished in her day may not be as immense as what Moses accomplished, yet there certainly are striking similarities between the two stories. Also, the term Grandma Moses is numerically equivalent to 808, which is the numerical equivalence of Takat, which means underneath or underground, hence Underground Railroad, a term which is synonymous itself with Grandma Moses herself. The end. And that brings us to a close. As always, continue to stay in prayer. Continue to uplift your sisters and encourage them to do better. Continue to strive for perfection and purity in all things righteous. Let us continue to glorify and magnify our wonderful, magnificent Creator, and ask that we be granted the continuous love that we have been granted. Until we meet again, this is your sister ChayaFyah saying shalom, signing off.